All right, well, today we are going to be looking at Romans 11, verses 25 through 27. And in this section of Scripture, Paul is trying to explain a divide that had existed between Jew and Gentile, and trying to explain the new relationship that both Jews and Gentiles would have in the light of the salvation that he had talked about in the beginning of the book of Romans. So Romans 11, 25 through 27 says this, and he's speaking to the Gentiles here. He says, "Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins." So, as I said before, we see this kind of divide here between Jew and Gentile. Paul is talking to these two different groups of people. The Jews had been God's chosen people. They had had all these promises and covenants made with them beforehand, and now it seems as though something was changing. Because the Jews had all these promises to them, the Gentiles were not a part of those promises. The Gentiles were the people who would miss out on those things. They were not a part of God's chosen people. They were those people who were rejected by God in the Old Testament, if we read it that way. But this verse tells us of God's grace in allowing Gentiles to participate in his promises, to be a part of his family and a part of his kingdom. And this would have been revolutionary to the Jews at the time, because they just wouldn't have understood it. It might have even been a bit insulting to the Jews as well, because here they were, God's chosen people, and now he was allowing other people in. And not only that, but there was a partial hardening that was going to happen to some of them, which means that they would miss out on some of the promises of God for this part of time anyway. But so these things take a little bit more explaining. First, what does a hardening mean? Well, according to the Strong's definition of hardening as used in this verse, it's categorized as the covering with a callous or obtuseness of mental discernment. Now, both of these things, a callous or obtuseness of mind, are temporary things. A callous can be removed, and if you're obtuse of mind, then you can learn things and gain some knowledge and wisdom on that issue to no longer be unclear on whatever you're unclear on. And the partial nature of these two things, both the callous and obtuseness of mind, whichever way you want to go with that, speak to the partial nature of the spiritual hardening of Israel. We are encouraged that this is not a forever thing that's going to happen. It's something that is just going to happen for Israel for a time. Also, that partial word there means that salvation is not closed off. This is what Paul is talking about, this hardening. They're hardened away from the gospel. The gospel message is not able to reach them in the same way as it is able to reach the Gentiles now. But it's a partial hardening. So some of Israel will still be able to respond to the gospel. This is why we see Jews who have converted to Christianity, because they are part of that remnant that God has left behind. They're not a part of the hardened Jews. God still has grace and mercy on his people. So, as I've said, this is hopeful for the Jews ultimately, because it speaks of the fact that one day this hardening will lift. There are some people who are hardened and the hardening will never go away. But there's the word "until" here as well as the word he uses for hardening itself. But the word "until" talks about a future time when God will lift this curse, I guess, that he's put on them, this hardening, so that they'll be able to respond to the gospel. And that moment will come when all of the Gentiles, says the fullness of the Gentiles, when that has been reached. So God has predetermined a number and a group of people within the Gentiles who will be saved, and once that number has been reached by his mercy and his grace, then the Jews will be able to, all of Israel, no longer will they be hardened, but all of them will be able to respond to his gift. It doesn't mean that they will be saved. It means that they have the opportunity now to respond to his gift of salvation. So these kinds of things, knowing that about the Jews and the Gentiles, should encourage us in two ways. The first thing is that we are Gentiles ourselves, and so we should rejoice in the fact that we now get to participate in God's promises, in maybe not all of the Old Testament promises, but we have this promise of salvation placed on our lives. God has allowed us into his family, and that barrier that was there from the beginning has been lifted. We no longer have to worry about being separated from God, as was the case in the Old Testament. The second way that we should be encouraged is we should be encouraged to evangelize. We know that God has predestined a certain amount of people that are going to be saved. He's predestined certain ones who will, make that fullness happen, the fullness of the Gentiles. That's a quantitative number there. And so because we know that there's a certain number of people that will be saved, we can be encouraged that when we go and evangelize, when we witness, our message is going to be heard by those people. And if it's going to be heard, it can be responded to. And so this is great news for us. We should love the world, and we should love our Jewish brothers and sisters. We should do all of these things because of these promises that we see in this verse. Now we're going to take a look at the last part of this section, 26 and 27. This speaks more specifically to the Jews. We've talked about how they've been hardened, but we haven't talked about how that's going to end or how that will resolve for them. So verse 26 and 27 says this, "And in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins." So to explain this a little further, we're going to look at this verse here in a second, but essentially God has a plan for the Jews. He has a plan for the way that he's going to redeem them. And this was talked about in the Old Testament. And in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 33, it says this, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." Now this is talking about a future time in which God is going to make a new covenant that will be written on their hearts, not just the law that they had written on stone or on scrolls. This is a different kind of covenant, and this is the covenant that these verses we've been looking at today is talking about. One day God will make that new covenant with them. So we should eagerly await that day. It's a great thing, that God has allowed the Jews to do that. Somewhere Paul says that how much greater it will be, how great it is the fact that we as Gentiles have received the promise. How much greater will it be when the Jews receive that promise as well? So it's a great thing to look forward to that God is going to do in all of our lives and for the Jews. So we should be eager about that day. The day where Jews and Gentiles will all participate in God's future glory and his promises. It's going to be an amazing thing to see the fulfillment of God's covenants, not only to us, but also to his people, all the ones that we read in the Old Testament, that he's promised to them, and to see the completion of that and the fulfillment of all of that. So, my question to you today is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in our discussion afterwards, but my question is, how will you respond to God's promises? How will you respond to God's promises? We've learned a lot of different things that are sometimes some difficult concepts as well, of why would God put a partial hardening on Israel? Why is he only now choosing to accept the Gentiles? Why was that not always the case? But these are all promises that God has made. These are all things that God has determined to be the way that they are. And so, how will you respond to that? How will you respond to the fact that God has chosen to work in history in this way?